Good afternoon and welcome to Reexamining Third-Party Risk Management around Critical Service Providers, a health system CIO production sponsored by ClearDATA. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name's Anthony Guerra. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Health System CIO, and I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You can send in your questions or comments anytime in the Q&A box, and we'll take them later in the program. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, first we're going to go about 40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Chris Akeroyd, SVP and CIO at Children's Health, Vince Fitzpatrick, Director of Information Security at ChristianaCare, and Chris Bowen, CISO and founder at ClearDATA, and then we will have our audience Q&A. So let's jump right in. Chris Akeroyd, let's start with you. You can give me an overview of your organization and your role.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon. Chris Akeroyd. I'm the Chief Information Officer for Children's Health in Dallas. We are a two-hospital health system, pediatric care, roughly about a little over $2 billion in revenue. It is a growing market here in the pediatric space, so we're a competitive market as well. So rapidly adapting and adopting new technologies and growth. My responsibilities span everything in the technology space, from infrastructure through application stack. We have cybersecurity up through me as well, analytics, and biomed. So we call it health technology management, but the biomed responsibilities are up through our IS division as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Vince?
Hello, I'm Vince Fitzpatrick, Director of Information Security at ChristianaCare. ChristianaCare is the largest hospital system in Delaware, the largest public employer. We have 3 hospitals, 2 in Delaware, 1 in Maryland, and opening up several community hospitals. That's about it.
Excellent, Vince. Thank you. Chris Bowen.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Bowen. I've started this process with ClearDATA about 14 years ago, I guess. Really, that just means I came with the furniture. And one of our primary directives in life in this company is to protect patient data. That's what we live and breathe for, is doing just that. And so my roles and responsibilities include sitting on the executive team, as well as managing our corporate security, working with our customers, governance, risk, and compliance. We get to have all these third-party conversations whenever we get a new vendor that we need to vet. It's a serious thing. I'm excited to talk about this because never in our history have we had so many challenges with third parties, business associates, if you will. So looking forward to this dialogue.
All right, very good. Chris Akeroyd, we're going to start with you. Health system IT executives have been focused on but struggling with third-party risk management for the past few years. In what ways should the Change Healthcare incident force people to think about the problem differently?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think it's a wake-up call. We've had a lot of these over the years, but this one, with Change kind of being the utility that they are in between a lot of our health system environments, clearinghouses, et cetera, I think it really emphasizes to me the impact of business continuity that these third-party services can have within our environment. So for us, we got to get down. We have to really understand process flows, data flows, and how we use these third parties and where they operate within our with our environment and how we rely on them, and looking at that from a couple different angles. But from right now, I think everything we see headline wise is that Change financially impacted and even operationally impacted many organizations. And so I'm looking at that from that business continuity standpoint of, okay, what's down? And then what are the contingency plans to go around that? And we can get into it later, but I think business continuity is an organizational wide responsibility, not an IT responsibility. And so it's our job to elevate that discussion and make sure it's happening appropriately.
Very good. Like you said, we'll get into a lot more detail there. But Vince, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I totally agree. At the time of change happening, we were actually doing a road show of going to all the departments and giving a talk about information security and stressing the idea of downtime. And if there's downtime, that's the business's responsibility to be ready for that. And then change happened, and we realized that we had all our eggs in one basket with change. So we were totally down with claims as a result. So going forward, we have to focus more on business continuity and make sure that we're not solely relying on one vendor, no matter how secure we think they are.
Excellent. Excellent. Chris Bowen.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the resiliency part. I mean, we remember the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. Thousands of startups are now without cash. So it's not just on the IT side. It's not on just it's also on the business side from where do you put your eggs as well. On the change side, just this morning, I was looking at some of the headlines. As you know, the CEO of United is going to be seen before Congress here shortly. And he admitted this whole change healthcare thing was related to IAM, identity and access management, because well, the ransomware variant was installed. It sat there for 9 days. The bad guys used a compromised password or compromised credential, and then it was all over. And to add insult to injury, and this is really where I get kind of frustrated with our healthcare systems, because they skip the basic hygiene that you have to have, and that is, this never would have happened had they put multi-factor authentication in place for the accounts that they were using. So if you think about all the damage that was done, if you think of how easily it could have been addressed with just proper hygiene, none of this would have happened. Now, I agree it was a wake-up call. The wake-up call, and I predict that regulators are going to say this should never happen again. We should never have a health system that has one vendor that is so powerful that it can bring down an entire system. That's just something that has to be addressed, in my opinion. I guess you could say I have some opinions.
Yeah, no, that's good. As we're here for opinions. Chris, I wanna go a little deeper into this issue about the no MFA on this account, and we may or may not be able to sort of parse anything out here, but I did an interview with a CISO a few days ago, and she told me that one of the sort of issues here is with these support accounts. So you have vendors, right? They're giving you these big systems. There are support people working for those vendors that need to get in to your network in order to do support.
Sure.
Um, and she said you can't put MFA on those accounts because they're generic. And so that's a challenge. And so she's got a process so where there's additional security added on, and it takes some more back and forth and some work, but it sort of mitigates this risk that's brought about by the fact that you can't put MFA on these accounts. Do you have any thoughts on that? That
Yeah, I
dynamic?
do. Yeah,
Yeah.
we do that all the time. We have, we're those that will go into a provider's systems, and we will go help manage those cloud workloads. And we absolutely use MFA. Absolutely. We know that the MFA and IAM in general is usually a customer responsibility. For example, they have to manage the identities, the access, all of that. But what we're seeing, and this is a special project that we took on with our customers, we saw some of our customers start to have some of that drift, some of the sloppiness in the hygiene, if you will. And whether it's our responsibility or not, we jumped in and said, hey, we're going to have conversations with our customers and tell them what we see. A lot of times there's just no visibility. I would add one more thing, and that is a compromised credential. Why are we using a compromised credential? How are we looking at our credentials? Are we making sure that our credentials are, have not been owned, if you will, by the dark web? I don't know how old these credentials were, but I can probably guaranteed that they were not actively used in a way that they would normally be, and that's why they got compromised. You know, it's again, it should make all of us quite frustrated that this happened in the first place. It could have been avoided so easily. So I don't buy the whole we can't do MFA. There's an edge case everywhere, Anthony, but normally you can secure the jewels to the kingdom, if you will.
All right, let's go around the horn with these sort of two issues. Chris Akeroyd, let's go to you first. Two things here. One is this idea of support accounts, vendors needing to access the applications. Uh, is that an issue that provides some difficulty in managing? And the other one, which Chris Bowen talked about, is a compromised credential. If we know the credential is compromised, we could take steps. But there can be cases where we get tricked, we give up our password and we don't realize it. We just thought, oh, that was someone from accounts payable, I'm going to move on with my life. We never have that aha moment. So it's on information security or IT in general to detect behaviors in the usage of that account that throw up red flags. So if you want to take those two, we'll go through those.
Well, and first I will fully agree with Chris Bowen and echo what he's saying. From our standpoint, we enforce multi-factor authentication on every account, third party or not. We even have third-party tools in place on, we don't obviously allow VPN access or any type of direct network access for our third parties. They have to go through other systems to do that. We even manage those accounts so closely when they're shared. So, Epic, for example, may have a support account, but it's deactivated all the time unless we have an active support ticket and have a conversation to turn those on. So those are tightly controlled and never left on. But I could use that as a segue to get into your second question. And I'll use a real world example. We're constantly in a learning mode of adapting and seeing what's changing here. And we had an incident not that long ago where it turned out that a employee's personal information through their Gmail account, personal everything at home, had been compromised. This person laid in wait, learned what they needed to learn, and impersonated them on a service desk called Reset Password. And some lessons learned that we took from this of one, and one of them, if you look back at like the MGM breach, for example, and how that happened, from what I've read on that was a password reset and an MFA endpoint reset at the same time. We didn't put our policies honestly in place quick enough, and that's a shame on us. But they are now, where you can't do both at the same time. So you really got to kind of question some of those processes of, I forgot my password. No, by the way, lost my phone at the same time. Well, it's a really bad day. So from an IT security standpoint, we're going to make your day a little worse, as we're not going to reset both. And you're going to have to wait a little bit. If you lost your phone, there's a lot more we need to talk about other than just your MFA endpoint. Maybe you need to come into the office, or we need to work through some special case. But so it's lessons like that. And I polled some peers recently about how do I start validating identity? Because now that I can learn about people and learn anything you want on social media and et cetera. One of the most simplistic solutions came to me from a peer, and that is what they're asking their remote employees to do is pull up their identification on a webcam. So if you called Reset Password, how do I make sure it's Chris Bowen? Well, all right, Chris Bowen, I need to see your driver's license right next to your face. And I think, okay, now I have a little bit more faith and trust that it's okay to reset this password. So those are processes we're currently putting in place now to kind of start trying to validate this a little more, because it's a growing concern for us.
Those are great points, Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
I mean, those are fantastic points. It's sad when we have dating websites that are more secure than our healthcare systems, because that's what they do as well.
Yeah.
Vince, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I believe I believe Chris and Chris are both correct. I think that the the flaw, the chink in the armor is the help desk. We're getting attacked constantly. People trying to impersonate physicians or nurses to reset their accounts, to reset their MFA, and that authentication piece of it is very difficult. We set up some text messaging alerts to the employee, some security questions, but we're a large health system. It doesn't that message doesn't reach everyone until they have to use the help desk, and then they're all of a sudden those options aren't available because they never set them up. So we have to then pass it off to their manager, which is time consuming, but it's a must.
Yeah, Vince, so makes me think of, I guess you can't overdo it with these things, with trying to authenticate someone. So if you get into the mindset of someone who's calling the help desk, let's say authentically, they're probably irritated, right? They're not calling because they're having a good day, so they're already pissed off. And I've been through situations where I don't know if it was dealing with the bank or whatever, where some of their vetting questionnaires to to vet my identity were insane. They were asking me about streets I grew up on and
Yeah.
have you ever lived in this address on this street? And I'm like, you know what? I don't know. I don't remember. Point being, I know we have to secure people, but there is a balance, right? We can't overdo it.
We
You
can. You're
can,
you're you're exactly right.
Who wants to comment? Anybody want to comment on that concept?
yeah, sorry, Vince, go ahead, and I've got a follow
Go
on.
ahead, Vince. Anything else you want to add there?
No, that's a big problem for us because we have physicians that they're in the middle of doing their caregiving, and they lose access, and they don't know who their manager is on record, or they don't know key pieces of information. So if we don't set up those security questions or that authentication via text message, they're out, and it's very bad.
Yeah, for sure.
And to add on to that, I mean, it's again, I'll give another real world example that we've dealt with is we were recently hit by a password spray attack. Something you can't really control. It happens to you. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's they grab a username and they just iterate through passwords, trying to see if they work. Well, it locks the account out. And Anthony, to your point, your question is and this is really where a lot of this education and communication to the business is important and critical, because the OR, our peri-op services, fired back really quick because it was some of our surgeons having this. And so now you're impacting on-time starts, and they calculate revenue in minutes. And so to call the service desk, have to wait on hold, because now we've got longer hold times because this has happened to a few people at this point. It's not a good internal experience. And so now I'm having a conversation of why are we costing the organization money? Just unlock the accounts. And so it is that security balance of timeout, hold on, we have to be cautious. At the same time, and this was a little bit of a question I didn't answer that you had earlier, is what are we doing on the automation side? What lessons are we learning, and how can we start scripting some of these things to learn and take advantage of what we're seeing? So how do we shut the spray attack down? We can't just sit here and let it happen. So how do we start mitigating some of that? So it's kind of two fronts that we had to deal through with that one.
Chris Bone, anything you want to add there?
No, I agree with both Vince and Chris. We just have to we have to find the balance, but we also have to remember what the consequences are if we get it wrong. So to your point, Chris, if you've got surgeons trying to start a surgery and they're not able to get in, that's a big deal. That's a problem. On the flip side, if you just unlock the accounts, that's also could be a huge problem as well. So it's something we have to pay attention to every single day, really.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. We know that silos are bad for data interoperability, but it also seems that silos are problematic when it comes to risk. Did the change incident reveal anything about the dangers of compartmentalizing risk, IT security risk from operational risk? Do we need to ensure that IT security risk is just one component of risk that rolls up to someone who takes an enterprise and holistic view? and who are the key leaders that IT executives have to work with. Um, when this thing was going down, and I was thinking about it, the Change Healthcare incident, I was thinking that, Change Healthcare is a big company. Although, when we learn about what happened, when we learn about what happened and some of the basic, as Chris Bowen said, some of the basic blocking and tackling that wasn't in place, maybe they wouldn't have passed a really good third party audit, by a potential customer, which is just stunning, right? Because you think, of course, a company like that is going to pass any kind of audit questionnaire that you would do. But there's a lot there on that question slide. So I'm going to let Vince go first. What are your thoughts here, Vince?
I know that we're pretty siloed in our risk management. We have a really good working relationship with privacy, but maybe not so good relationship with finance or other risk departments. I think it would be excellent if we had an overarching risk framework that we could discuss these issues or these concerns.
Yeah, so and Chris Akeroyd touched on this idea before when he talked about the speed with which learning and observations translates into policies. Right, Chris? You mentioned that before. So we see something out in the wild, we see a dynamic, we're made aware of a known vulnerability. Um, how quickly can we get that into a policy that mitigates the risk?
Yeah,
So the Vince, what you're talking about is, yeah, we could do a lot better job of getting visibility to risk. So how quickly can we make that happen? Right?
Yeah,
I agree.
we're working on it. We're trying.
Yeah, very good. Chris Akeroyd, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think its speed comes down to readiness in the organization and how well versed the C-suite is and how well versed the board is on what risks look like, and how that impacts business. So for us, it's a regular conversation that we're having from board level down of what's the impacts some of these things can be. And so when we make swift decisions that really don't have a lot of approval or just kind of unilateral, that you know what, we're no longer resetting MFA at the same time. That was a 30-second decision. We didn't take any approval. I'll take my lumps later on that one. And I feel fully defensible that we've had these conversations. And Chris Bowen alluded to it of I can't trust, and if I trust once, it's over. And you hear the saying a lot, from a health system standpoint, we have to be perfect all the time. And the bad guy has to be right once. And that's really what it comes down to. We try to manage to that and we communicate to that point a lot internally.
Chris Akeroyd, it is this concept, and I have heard this before from someone in your position of I'm going to err on the side of shutting it down, of shutting it off, and I'm going to, as you mentioned, I'm going to take my lumps. It's going to happen, but that's how I'm deciding to err. And do you think that's probably prevalent across the board these days?
Actually, great question. We do a lot of tabletops, and that is what we always communicate is we're going to err on this. We're going to hit the off switch, whatever it may be. And whatever, and every situation's different. We had an incident recently where a third party was breached that had connectivity in, and we went to flip it off. And some of our clinical leadership threw up their hands and said, "Hold on a second, you're going to impact patient care." And they went as far as having the conversation of you could kill somebody. Well, in the moment, I'm an IT guy. I'm not a clinician. I'm going to have to trust my clinicians, but I'm a little worried because time is risk. Following after that event, we did an after action look at that, and we further determined that that's really not the case. There aren't any systems that if we turned off would discontinue functioning and harm a patient or kill a patient. So if I deactivated a bunch of accounts, okay, they go into a downtime, maybe the radiology device is in downtime, but they're still capturing images and we're not losing things there and et cetera. So it's it's a very limited, if existing at all, case where that occurs. And so we reinforce that. And even I took that to the board as saying, this is a situation, decisions that happened in the moment. These are the corrective actions we need to take in the future of we have to be a little bit more aggressive with these things to protect the broader organization. So it's a conversation of siloed impact versus broad impact, and what do we need to do for resiliency.
Chris Bowen, we're getting into such a weird time in healthcare. And what I'm thinking is, especially on the security side, the mantra you would hear from CISOs recently is we don't want to be the Department of No, right? We don't want to be the Department of No. But now we're hearing security executives and other IT executives saying, I'm going to hit the off switch. These are coming at each other.
Yeah. Chris threaded the needle quite well with what his words were. I think it depends. The question to restate it is, how quickly can we make policy changes? And the reason I say it depends is because it depends on the architecture. It depends on your technology. I'll give you an example. At ClearDATA, we have a managed detection and response team. We look at telemetry from our cloud systems, from our customers' cloud systems 24/7. And if we see someone being compromised in a certain way, we'll throw out automated changes to the group policies or whatever it needs to happen to block some of this from ever happening for the other 200 customers that we have. And so it's this contributory network where we have this advantage where we see one thing over here and we deploy countermeasures all over the place, and we do that very quickly. What we've seen happen before, though, is if you do shut something down and a customer may not have something, let's say they've put something in a container. It's ephemeral. Every time you patch it, it rewrites everything over, and maybe somebody put something in there that they shouldn't have, a misconfiguration or something. And when you shut that down, if there's logging not enabled on the container itself, you've just lost your evidence as well. So you have to think about what kind of technology you're using. You have to think about, are you using a CloudFormation template to redeploy? Are you using a Terraform technology, something like that? You just have to understand your systems to be able to confidently shut things down. We've done this in the past with customers. They've been very mad at times, but at times they've also said, you just saved our hospital. And those are tough decisions, Chris, to make, because you're gonna have to defend the decision. But it's not an easy one to make.
Vince,
It's not.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, Anthony. I was going to add on because you said the Department of No, and maybe in my mind I'm just spinning it that way, but I don't feel like I'm saying no. I'm trying to say that this is risk, and this is we're all leaders, and this is how we should manage. And so I feel like there is buy-in, and it's not IT saying hard stance. I don't care if you like it or not. I think we all have to get on the same page of what this looks like. And so, like I said, maybe I'm spinning in my mind to make myself feel better, but I've been trying to be careful not to be that Department of No, because then you just get pushback and resistance, and they find other ways around you. But
there are some times when you have to say no, obviously. We've been vetting a potential vendor that refuses to give us, and you'll appreciate this, all of you, refuses to give us a third-party attestation of how they're doing from their security controls. They just refuse to give it. In those cases, you say hard no. I can't trust you. So no.
Yeah,
but
that's our job. You're right.
Yeah.
Vince, anything on what you're hearing you want to jump in?
At ChristianaCare, we're pretty lucky because the executives on down understand the information security risk. So when those situations arise where we have to turn something off, I think as long as we give them ample notice before shutting it down and listen to their feedback, they're all right with closing something off.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that, this idea of feedback and ample notice, because Chris Akeroyd just told a very fascinating anecdote, and I want to go into that and talk about that dynamic a little more. In the past, the dynamic had been the clinicians throw out the word patient safety and you're done. You're shut down. You're not going to do anything. That was the trump card. Chris, you just told a very interesting story where you did a little research and you said, well, not quite. So we I don't agree with that assessment, or we don't agree with that assessment that you're saying it impacts patient safety. We think there's a minimal impact to patient safety and a major impact to security risk. And this is how this decision's going to be made. It is different. It is a new dynamic to have information IT reassessing a clinical opinion on patient safety risk. Your thoughts?
I agree. I mean, we're not qualified as technicians to assess clinical impact, and that's where I have to have that good partnership there on the clinical side of things. And so after the dust settles and emotions are down, let's really walk through this and let's be practical. And that was the conversation. It took some conversation to get to the point that we all agreed that, okay, you're right. In this case, it was a radiology clinic connected to our environment, but we would not have lost any imaging. It would have, all the MRIs have been captured offline. And so it goes back to something I think we started this conversation with is, what are the downtime procedures? What are your business continuity things? Because sometimes technology is just going to fail right in the middle of a procedure. And that happens all the time. We lose power or the server, crashed. So many things are out of our control when this happens. So how do we handle that? And do we kill people when that happens, or do we cause patient harm? I should probably say. And bringing it back to some of just the factual based conversation allowed for the clarity in the decision making to occur. Because I'm not qualified to tell a physician he's wrong on how he treats a patient, but we can at least get to the factual basis of it.
Chris Bowen, what I'm thinking is that if you're going to be successful as an IT executive, especially in security, and you're going to be making these decisions, where sometimes you're going to have to shut something off or not, uh, not sort of approve someone who's trying to go through MFA at the help desk because you don't feel they've verified their identity, you're going to need really strong executive support above you, because there are going to be complaints. And if those complaints resonate with whoever is above you, and they say, you know what, Chris Akeroyd, just do it, just let them through. They're really mad and whatever. You, you can't operate like that, right? So anyway, Chris, your thoughts, Chris Bowen.
Yeah, this takes me back to Merck. If you remember that NotPetya event several years ago, the CISO Terry Rice was. We were talking once, and I asked him how did this go from an executive perspective. Normally, a CISO in the past would just get fired if something bad like that happened, and in his case, it was absolutely opposite. It was absolute confidence, and it was absolute, what do you need to make sure that we have what we have to deploy to make this better, to fix this. It wasn't a blank name the scapegoat game. It was all about, how do we help? And I think in a healthy executive culture, you're not coming at your fellow executives with a pointed finger. You're coming with them to solve the problems together, because you can't do this as a CIO by yourself or a CISO by yourself. You have to have full support from your board. You have to have full support from your CEO. You have to, it's ideal that Chris Akeroyd, reports into the CEO. Hopefully that's the case. I report into the CEO. It's one of those, set up your structure correctly, and everything seems to work because you're aligned on a weekly basis anyway. If you have some of those executives that are, pop shotting at you, you may have the wrong executive team. You really need to row the boat to your past career events. You need to row the boat in a way that's consistent with everyone else going through the same motion.
All right, very good. Let's talk a little bit about third-party risk management. Conversations I've had, I mean, the vendor submitted questionnaires, just not the ideal way to let the person or the entity you're trying to evaluate themselves, and you get perhaps a snapshot in time for one moment. You could have hundreds of vendors. You change those procedures. Do you go back to the vendors that have been approved under a different process and reevaluate those? It's a mess, and I've heard people say it's an absolute mess. It really, and I don't think people feel it really mitigates risk. It's sort of an exercise in doing something for the sake of doing something, but perhaps that's too harsh. Vince, let's start with you. Thoughts around the current process of third party risk management for the vendors, uh, and how you think it's going, and do you think maybe there's something better on the horizon?
So we do the questionnaire based on the SIG-Lite questionnaire. We collect documentation such as SOC 2 Type 2 reports or high trust reports. It works to help in the contracting process. If there's glaring flaws that we can update the contract to remediate those. But it's not ideal, and I don't think anyone has an ideal solution out there. We only have really one and a half people working on third party, so there's not much we can do. We're hoping to, with automation, focus more on the SOC 2 Type 2 report and digging through that, and maybe get away from the questionnaire and only do the questionnaire when there's some reason why they don't have a SOC report.
Very good, Chris Bowen. Vince just talked about no glaring flaws in a questionnaire. Well, there's a lot of people who would never submit a questionnaire with a glaring flaw. It's just not going to be there. We talked about change. If we have this right based on news reports and certain accounts not having MFA, you're not going to get a questionnaire back that says we don't use MFA on these accounts, right? So,
No,
I mean,
no,
what are your thoughts there?
no. First of all, you have to tier your vendors, those who can touch your PHI. There's not all vendors are the same. And so tiering a vendor that says, hey, I'm going to potentially touch your PHI. Well, then now you start to get up in their grill. Uh, Questionnaires don't work. I don't think. I mean, certainly you can get a flavor of what you're doing, what your program is, but it doesn't necessarily prove anything. Even third party attestations like the SOC 2. I mean, there are certain governance and risk folks that are, we would call them Houdinis, who answer the question just the right way, and an auditor won't even pick up on it. That might be intentionally disingenuous or not, but there's 1,000 ways to game a system. So you know, I don't know. It's a tough problem. I think having some kind of on-ramp or some kind of a credit score, if you will, for the security controls that are in place is great. I think having, every 2 years, a high trust period of human sacrifice, I call it, to go through that is helpful. I just think, the most effective is to just really, really get in and get to know your vendor as much as you can, and ask the questions. Get on the phone with them. You visit them if you can. I know people are averse to visiting nowadays, but we got to get back on the road and start doing some of this. I don't have the silver bullet, but
Well, it's a really good advice there, Chris, about tiering the vendors, and also made me think of the story you said about the particular vendor who refused to submit any documentation to you. Well, that made it easy. So now,
yeah,
now I don't
yeah,
have to parse out whether or not there's anything accurate or missing in this questionnaire. You said you're not giving it to me. We're done.
yeah,
Easy.
yeah.
Chris Akeroyd, your thoughts?
I'm going to agree a lot with Chris Bowen on this, and I'm glad he got the answer before I did, because it's a tough it's a tough question. You're right. I mean, I think in my almost 10 years here, we probably have had 2 to 3 vendors that failed that initial pass of answering the questions right. Some of them, unfortunately, one answered it truthfully, and we said that doesn't even work. But you usually don't get the truthful answers, and there's sometimes limited ways to validate. But even getting back to the Change Healthcare or even UKG, those two major ones that I think we've dealt with recently, they've all passed all of our organizations. And Chris used the word earlier, I like it, it's called drift. Sometimes things just happen. There's a little bit of a change in process that maybe a SOC 2 is not going to pick up. And I do like the sacrificial metaphor there, because that does sometimes feel that way. So I think we just have to do our due diligence up front to make sure that we trust, and the tiering the vendor is right. How comfortable are we with this vendor that they're taking care of our data? Are the contractual language in place on liability and indemnification? And then do we understand impacts if something does happen? Because I think it can happen to anybody. So do we know where our data is, how it's flowing, and what those impacts to our organization are?
Chris, I think that's important. That's understated. I think the importance of knowing where your data is at is so critical. Because again, if you're in the middle of an incident and you're trying to figure out what's infected, what's impacted, et cetera, if you know exactly where your data is, and you've got part of your system over here with no access to PHI, and you've got your database over here with where it should be, knowing where that's at is makes all the difference in the world from a timing perspective and a potential reporting perspective.
Yeah, and it's the way our process works, and probably not unique, but we're onboarding a vendor. We go through that initial questionnaire. We don't really get into the nitty gritty until we're starting to build it and architect it, of what's the architecture, and then what type of data flows. And I'll use UKG as an example for us, as we architect to the least required, or low, the minimum required data sets. So I don't need to send, when it comes to our people records, the time and attendance, I don't need to send social security number up to UKG Kronos. And we didn't, fortunately. We had it limited down to things that would not have classified it as PII leaking there. So it was like an employee number and maybe a name, and that was about it. So I think a lot of that makes a difference too, in how you architect and mitigate some of that risk going into the project.
I think it's difficult to assess risk for our own organizations. It's not simple. A lot of effort goes into that. And that's when we have visibility. We can hire vendors, come in and look at our systems. It's almost impossible to do that for somebody else that you have no visibility into. So I think it's almost like an unachievable goal.
No, it's a good point, Vince. And I think people are trying to figure out a better way, but it sounds like we're not there yet. Would you agree with that?
Definitely.
Yeah. All right, very good. Chris Bowen, let's talk a little bit about the cloud-based workloads. Any unique nuances to risk when it comes that come into play when assessing cloud-based workloads as opposed to those on-prem?
I mean, the basics are still the same. If we think about defense in depth, we think about how to architect a system. The way you go about things is a completely different thing, though. I talked a little bit about Terraform and CloudFormation, and we talked a little bit about containers. And it was a fascinating exercise when I had to educate our legal counsel on what containers were several years ago. That was, it was a foreign concept at the time, and now it's fairly well understood. Now we have AI. Let's not forget that. How do we use that? What are we using it for? How do we validate that it's not hallucinating, and making sure that the data that we are training on is staying put where it should? There's just all kinds of nuances to the cloud. Incorporating a specific service. We go through all kinds of detail in our compliance reference architecture documentation to identify and surface the risk that could happen from using a specific service. Or even if you're putting a different service together with a service that may not be designed for it, how does that impact your risk? And how does all of that align not only to what you're trying to do from a business perspective and an innovation perspective, but from a regulatory perspective? And then how do you align the safeguards to prevent the drift, as we've talked about earlier? I would say there's lots and lots of nuances for architecting and working in the cloud. It's not insurmountable, but Chris knows. I mean, he works with cloud workloads as well, and I'm sure Vince does. It's you have to have a very, as Liam Neeson would say, I have a very special set of skills. You have to have those set of skills, right?
That's great. Vince, any thoughts on cloud?
No, I think the same like cyber hygiene foundation applies. Whether it's account management or patching, you might have to use different tools to get that done, but it's this, the same result.
Chris?
Add on to what Chris Bowen was saying, completely agree with it. From my perspective too, I mean, I guess bringing it internally, when we get into this multi-cloud environment, Chris Bowen highlighted it perfectly of how do GCP and AWS and Azure, are you upskilled? Are your teams capable? Do they understand this? Do they have the expertise to be turning certain things on and setting certain parameters? And that's part of the things that keep me awake at night is as these clouds continue, and it's happening to us. I mean, we've got all three in production, but how deep are we internally, and how do we lean to partners to help there and keep that posture sound? And we're good at doing on-prem, but we've got to grow these muscles better, in my opinion, on the cloud side of it.
All right, very good. I'm going to go to my favorite segment and see what you folks would like to ask each other. So, Chris Bowen, we're going to start with you. Do you have a question for one or both of your brilliant co-panelists?
They are brilliant co-panelists, and I appreciate them very much. So, I've just been listening to this conversation. It's been fascinating. The biggest challenge that I see in this whole scenario is, this whole change. We talked about change at the beginning. Is how do we get from being this snowflake of a system, this critical infrastructure called healthcare? What are your thoughts, Vince and Chris, on how we become more resilient and not have a change healthcare situation ever happen again?
All right, that's a tough one. So, who am I going to throw that to first? Chris, you're smiling, so you're going to get punished by having to answer that. Chris Akeroyd.
I was laughing, hoping I wouldn't be first.
I know. I didn't want to do that to Vince, so I'm doing it to you.
That's fair. That's fair. It's and I think that's the question we're working through internally of how do we continue to be more resilient. We're an interesting industry where we are very porous. We have a lot of partnerships to deliver the whole care model. Even if I look at my user base, we're an academic medical center, so I have academic providers. I have community physicians that have accounts, and I've got many people logging into our systems. When I look at the third-party side of things, there's a lot of I'm continuing to add more SaaS product, put more risk into, I guess diversifying risk out there a little bit. But I've said it a couple times, and I'm leaning into it because I think this is the only thing that's making sense to me right now but I need to know where my critical workflows are. I need to tier them. I need to go through, make sure we've practiced and we've got business continuity, disaster recovery behind those. I saw some organizations during the change event, they pivoted quickly on the payer side. They were able to pivot to a competitor quick. And so what that tells me is they've probably prepared, maybe had this discussion internally as well of, okay, if something like this happened, we need to have legal ready to get the T's and C's right and get this actioned. Or do you absorb the cost just to have somebody onboarded and integrated? I don't know the answer to that, but at a minimum, I think the conversation needs to be happening of it's all hands on deck. We got to figure out how to get revenue, in this case, back to our organization. So that's from my standpoint, what it is really tiering that risk, working through the business continuity and disaster recovery processes around it.
Excellent. Vince?
I think it's continuing to have strong communication with executive management on the business side, letting them know that information security does not have the answer for everything. Like they're not going to flip the switch to get everything back up and running. That there will be downtime, and they have to be ready for that.
Yeah. Chris Bowen. Oh, I'm sorry. You asked the question, so I'm not gonna I'm
You have
not
to
gonna
answer
kick
your
it to
own.
you. No, but I mean,
It's like, Senator, this is the question you really meant to ask.
yes, yes. No, but I think it's almost perhaps too early for people to say, okay, here's exactly the path forward based on change, but at the very least, it's the realization that this needs much more analysis, these workflows and heavy workloads. And you would not be able to pick out the next change incident if you just had an IT or even an IT security view of risk. You wouldn't see it because you wouldn't have found out on any questionnaire. And IT is not going to be the one to realize how much goes through this one pipe from a operations point of view. That's not an analysis IT is going to be doing. So it needs that different view. And we're still in the process of working and doing that. So next opportunity to ask a question. Vince, would you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
Yes, both. Like where do you see the affiliation between business continuity and disaster recovery and information security's role in that process? So, like, I feel that if we go too far into business continuity, we're doing somebody else's job and maybe not doing it well.
I think that's a great question, and I've delved into that in many conversations. So, Chris Bowen, let's start with you.
Yeah, let's talk about that. We're actually working on some of that right now at ClearDATA. And one of the first things I asked for was give me updated system diagrams. Can we document what we have out there? Where is it? What subnet is it sitting in? Is it accessible to the public? What are our management planes? Let's make sure that we understand what we've got, so that if I'm driving across the desert, I know when I need to turn in for gas, for example. You've got to understand what you've got. You've got to document it. You've got to keep that up to date. And it's not just having a network diagram. You need the whole system so that you can understand what data is where. To Chris's point, you have to understand where your data is going and where it should be going. And if you have a deviation from that, then you've got some things to fix. But in terms of the difference between business continuity and disaster recovery, it's a very fine line to go from continuity to full-on disasters. We've seen with the Change Health. It started out as an IT problem and quickly became a business problem. So we have to train our teams. We have to do the tabletops. We have to test our resiliency on a regular basis. Again, it comes back down to hygiene, just what you should be doing in the first place.
Chris Akeroyd.
It is a great question, and one I'm constantly having internally, because one of my fears is that we have an incident and let's say it's worst case ransomware and we're down, and from an IT disaster recovery standpoint, I've got the technical staff focused on recovery. What are we going to do to get services restored? And so for me, that's where DR is. What the responsibility is on the business continuity side of what are the operational plans to do payroll, accounts payable, treat the patient, care for the patient without technology. And those have to be largely created and owned by the business. And where I feel it comes into a three-way partnership. And so we've got a business continuity department here, and they're not operational experts across the health system, whether it be back office or clinical, but they are skilled at having a conversation. And so let's just say you bring supply chain to the table and we walk through that business impact analysis of all the technology they use and say, okay, it's off. And let's make sure here's the templates we use, but let's get it into a template. Now we got to tabletop that. And so that's what I'm leaning into my BC partners for is, are we tabletopping the operational workflows while I'm also having the same expectation of the IT side of, are we doing the tabletops on the technical sides? Do we know how to do the recoveries? Do we know where the backups are? Have we tested them? What does our cybersecurity playbook look like, and are we validated that? And so that to me is the balance of BC and DR, but it's a very fine line, as Chris Bowen mentioned, that it gets very blurry and very confusing, and a lot of times it's like, oh gosh, IT, what are we going to do? How do we pay people?
Vince, if I can offer a thought,
Sure.
one of the best answers to this question came from a gentleman named Sanjeev Shah, who's with Common Spirit. He's an IT security executive, and in a conversation we were having on a webinar, and where we were delving into this exact issue, he said it should be the job, or it can be the job of IT to champion the causes without owning them. So if you have unique insight into a vulnerability or a risk, his point was that yes, if you see it and other people don't see it, theoretically, it is your responsibility to
Mhm.
surface it and champion it, but without owning it, right? So because you can't own everything you see, and some of those are totally out of your wheelhouse. So you have to I thought that was a great answer. Um anyway.
No, I agree with you, Anthony. It's if you see something, say something, do something. You can't just ignore it.
Right, right. Hopefully it doesn't turn out where, the kid who asks a question in class is told, "Great question, go write a report on it." Right? That you
Right.
don't want to own it every time you point out a vulnerability. So yes, good stuff. Um, I unfortunately, Chris Akeroyd, I don't really have time to let you ask your question. So what we're going to do is a lightning round of final thoughts. Best piece of advice for people listening and just trying to make sure change doesn't happen to them, so to speak. Um, let's start with you, Chris Akeroyd.
All right, final thoughts there is inventory your workflows, your data, know it. What are the impacts? If change is down today, what's impacting your environment? And I think that in some cases it took us some time to figure that out because it was so broad, but know it in advance, have that solid inventory.
Excellent, Vince. Final thought.
Just cyber hygiene, do the basics well.
Excellent, Chris Bowen. Sounds like Chris Akeroyd touched on what you were saying about you have to know where everything is.
Well, it's in my opinion, you also need to understand your integrations. How can you pivot an API from one place to another? Chris talked about it during the change health, where people were switching pretty quickly. Understanding those integrations is also almost just as important as understanding where your data is at.
Excellent discussion. Great stuff. Regarding continuing education, you could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this event is ready for viewing. If you want to work with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for upcoming panels. With that, I want to thank this tremendous panel, Chris Akeroyd, Vince Fitzpatrick, and Chris Bowen, and ClearDATA for sponsoring and making this conversation possible, and you for attending. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.